Greetings and welcome back to room 303, the Harvard Classics Lectures. This is lecture number 117. We are now in Walden chapter 18, Conclusion. It's been a long journey, of course, and I'm happy that you've been able to hang with me all the way to the end. And of course, many have argued that you read all of Walden to get to the conclusion. And obviously the question is, and I've called this now through my lectures a great prose poem, one of the obvious questions is, how do you end such a text as this? At the conclusion, you'll remember of our last lecture, we said that he finishes with, oh yeah, and the second year was a whole lot like the first year, and that was kind of the end of it, kind of almost an abrupt ending. But it's really not an ending. We now come to the ending. Now our assumptions, of course, are that you've been hanging with us at learnstrong.net, especially in the Harvard Classics folder through lectures 99 to 116, and as well in the junior folder for some of our comments on American transcendental thought. Our other assumption is that you've paid attention to our 3 levels of reading. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? 2a, themes, messages. 2b, rhetoric. Not what Thoreau says, but how he says it. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3a, to other texts, like for example other chapters, we've made references, and we'll do so again here, to prior chapters, and then of course to other texts we know. And then I'm even going to play that game at 3a here in a second, because I'm going to make the suggestion that Marcus Aurelius has been standing behind all of Meditations, all of Walden, right up until the end, and here we'll hear some of that. And then finally, and most important, and I think it's huge to talk about putting the foundations under castles in the air, or marching to the beat of your own drummer, and all the other famous lines from this final concluding chapter, that you have a personal response. We have said, we are the stories we tell and retell, the stories we accept and the stories we reject. But I'm going to challenge you, before you reject a story like Walden, and the story that is the Thoreau story as well, that you at least have a sense of what it is that you're rejecting. Finally, our last assumptions are that you've been following our stuff and know about what we call our Big Five in 303. What does this text in conclusion, chapter 18, say about epistemology, what one can know, ontology and who one is, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, the understandings as it relates to the group, and then finally the question of theodicy. Why is it that pain and suffering have to happen in this world, and what can we do to somehow counterbalance it? Well, here, if we've been saying we're needing Thoreau as mystic, Thoreau as botanist, Thoreau as, and so on and so on, here we're going to see Thoreau finally as prophet, and I think the Tiresias figure, as well as Thoreau as dramaticist. I think it's pretty clear that he has a bit of an understanding of, not just Shakespeare, but Aristotle and the poetics here. I actually want to begin, though, our lecture, and I kind of told you I was going to do this, by working just for a few seconds with a few lines from Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, Book 5. Aurelius, the great Stoic philosopher, we've given lectures on him at learnstrong.net, Aurelius says it this way: in the morning, when thou risest unwillingly, let this thought be present: I am rising to the work of a human being. Why then am I dissatisfied if I'm going to do the things for which I exist and for which I was brought into the world? Or have I been made for this, to lie in the bedclothes and keep myself warm? But this is more pleasant. Dost thou exist, then, to take thy pleasure, and not at all for action and exertion? Dost thou not see the little plants, the little birds, the ants, the spiders, the bees, working together to put in order their several parts of the universe? And art thou unwilling to do the work of a human being, and dost thou not make haste to do that which is according to thy nature? But it's necessary to take rest also. It is necessary. However, nature expounds to this too. She expounds both to eating and drinking, and yet thou goest beyond these bounds, beyond what is sufficient. Yet in thy acts it is not so. But thou stoppest short of what thou canst do. So thou lovest not thyself. For if thou didst, thou wouldst love thy nature and her will. But those who love their several arts exhaust themselves in working at them unwashed and without food. But thou valuest thy own nature less than the turner values the turning art, or the dancer the dancing art, or the lover of money values his money, or the vainglorious man his little glory. Well, I think it's significant that we start here. Because if there has been a voice from the classical tradition that has been the whole way with us through our study of Walden, I think it's been Plato, and then of course I think it's been Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic Platonist thinker. As we turn now to chapter 18, let's hear some of those same kinds of echoes in the American, of course, tradition, which is what makes this so much fun. In his conclusion, Thoreau again will remind his readers it's time to begin a new, a higher life. He'll point out that we often do restrict ourselves. We restrict our view of the universe by accepting these limits that are really kind of externally imposed. And he urges us to make life a journey. And, of course, this won't shock us from our study of chapter 2, deliberately, intentionally, to look inward, to make the interior voyage of discovery, the Odyssey. And I think, as we have said all along, it's so significant that Homer has been with us all the way, as of course has been Virgil as well. Now, he's going to talk about some of the great explorers. Mungo Park, Lewis and Clark, of course, Frobisher will be there, as well as, obviously, Columbus, right? He's going to talk about the inner exploration, and in some ways comparable to the exploration of the North American continent. And we've talked already at length, I think, about T.S. Eliot and Four Quartets. I've given full lectures on every line of Four Quartets, and I think it's important that we recognize how influential Thoreau was to the work of T.S. Eliot, and we're playing the game, obviously, from the second of the Four Quartets, East Coker, when he says, "All men ought to be explorers. Here and there does not matter. We must be still and still moving," right? And we're going to hear some of this as well. Now, Thoreau's going to explain why he left the woods. I mean, and this is always, I mean, even from the time when he left Walden, there were people who called him a hypocrite. If it was so great, then how come you just didn't stay there and live? I mean, obviously you did it for a little while and then you, wimped out or something? He's going to give us the reason. He's going to say that he left for the same reason that he went there, and then he's going to talk about the multiple lives that he will share with us. He says there is a danger, he says, even in a new enterprise, of it becoming too habitual, falling into a pattern of tradition, conformity. And in some ways, this, I think, is his critique of religion. I mean, religion is just to do something repeatedly. You can brush your teeth religiously, yes, over and over again. And I think he's obviously very concerned about that. He says, you got to move forward. You got to be optimistic. You got to move towards your dreams. You got to leave some things behind. And obviously, you have to have a certain kind of awareness of others, things that are going to become important. He says, a man will replace his former thoughts and conventional common sense with a broader understanding, and obviously putting a solid foundation under your castles in the air, your dreams, your aspirations. He'll express the confidence that is obviously a very Thoreauian confidence that men's dreams, all of our dreams, are not only achievable, but the experiment, as he will call it, it's his word, at Walden, really does demonstrate this successfully. I love that he calls it an experiment. And then he talks about truth and the experience of truth. And humans can attain to this, but he says it can't be explained in normal language. It is translinguistic. It's beyond language. It's got to be, his word is translated through a more expressive, a more figurative, suggestive language. Obviously poetry, obviously Walden is this. He then will tell his readers to accept and make the most of what they are, to mind our business, quote unquote, not somebody else's idea of what our business should be. This sounding very much like Emerson, the great mentor for Thoreau, in Self-Reliance. You can go back and take a look at those comments. I've given lectures on that. He presents then the parable, this is a wonderful one, of the artist of Carew who strove for perfection, and he had this single-mindedness of purpose, and he gave him perennial youth. He never got old because of it. He will talk about transcending time. He will talk about the decay of civilization. He will talk about how the artist can endure because the artist creates true art and therefore achieves perfection. And then he comments that this parable will demonstrate the endurance of truth. Finally, he will urge all of us to face life as it is. Get rid of the materialism of our life and to embrace simplicity, as well to cultivate self serenely, to understand differences between the permanent and the temporal, right? That is to say, those two boxes that we sometimes will refer to when we talk about transcendental thought, the physical and then the metaphysical. And then finally, Walden ends. He talks about resurrection. He talks about immortality through the quest for higher truth, taking us back, of course, to the Higher Laws chapter. And then one more time, he'll use the morning imagery that obviously all the way through this book has been the key mantra. We must, you'll remember from the second book chapter, we must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn. It is the dawn that we will, in fact, finish with. There is more day to dawn. He says, only that day dawns to which we are awake. There is more day to dawn. The sun, the final lines, is but a morning star. I love that star is the last word of Walden, as we have pointed out in our lectures on any number of titles, from Dante's Inferno to Milton's Paradise Lost. Last words are fun for us. What are they? And yeah, it's fun stuff. But star is the last word of Walden. The conclusion. Now, as I've said, I would love it if I could just read it all to you, because of all of the chapters of Walden, it seems to me the conclusion might be the one that deserves the most reading, and so I will dip in for a while here and enjoy some of the greatest prose ever written, prose poetry ever written. To the sick, the doctors wisely recommend a change of air and scenery. Thank heaven, here is not all the world. The buckeye does not grow in New England, and the mockingbird is rarely heard here. The wild goose is more of a cosmopolite than we. He breaks his fast in Canada, takes a luncheon in the Ohio, plumes himself for the night in the southern bayou. Even the bison, to some degree, keeps pace with the seasons, cropping the pastures of the Colorado, only till a greener and sweeter grass awaits him by the Yellowstone. We have to smile as we reference that he makes something of the Yellowstone for us, right? Those of us that live out west here. Notice what he's saying. All of nature is constantly on the move. All of nature is constantly about transmigration, right? Transcendence, moving, evolution, right? And obviously we know where he's going. Yet we think that if rail fences are pulled down and stone walls piled up on our farms, bounds are henceforth set to our lives and our fates decided. If you are a chosen town clerk, forsooth, you cannot go to Tierra del Fuego this summer. And it's, of course, that he mentions that will obviously carry some weight for us with our love of Darwin. That you may go to the land of infernal fire, nevertheless. The universe is wider than our views of it. And there it is, right? A brilliantly constructed first paragraph in this chapter. The universe is wider than our views of it. It's all about perspective. It's all about perspicacity, as we have said. Go back to our lectures on Plato's Republic, especially the cave allegory. Yet we should oftener look over the taffrail of our craft like curious passengers and not make the voyage like stupid sailors picking oakum. The other side of the globe is but the home of our correspondent. Our voyaging is only great circle sailing, and the doctors prescribe for diseases of the skin merely. And then he quotes, direct your eye right inward, and you'll find 1,000 regions in your mind yet undiscovered. Travel then and be expert in home cosmography. A few lines later, he's ready to talk about Columbus. Now, of course, Whitman as well had a famous poem about Columbus, and we should point out, we are the stories, yes, it is true, we accept and we retell, but we're also the stories that we reject. And obviously, Columbus is for us a problematic figure today. For Thoreau and for Whitman, Columbus represented what really was one of the great explorers of all time. And we want to give Columbus obviously his due, while at the same time critiquing, and I think properly critiquing, some of the terrible things for which he is known as well. But here we go. Be a Columbus to whole new continents and worlds within you. Notice it's within you. Opening new channels, not of trade, but of thought. Every man is the lord of a realm, besides which the earthly empire of the czar is but a petty state, a hummock left by the ice. Yet some can be patriotic who have no self-respect and sacrifice the greater to the less. These lines are quite remarkable because they are written preceding to, obviously, the horrific civil war that will soon be on the country. They love the soil which makes their graves, but have no sympathy with the spirit which may still animate their clay. Patriotism, he says, is a maggot in their heads. This is interesting critique, and of course it has all kinds of powerful weight for the days that quickly will come to American history. He says, after talking about Zanzibar and the cats in Zanzibar, he says, if you would learn to speak all tongues and conform to the customs of all nations, if you would travel farther than all travelers, be naturalized in all climes, and cause the Sphinx to dash her head against a stone, even obey the precept of the old philosopher, and explore thyself. Now this notion of the Delphi Oracle has always been here with us as well, because of course Thoreau loves the very idea of Socrates in Plato's Apology, being that one who tries to challenge the Delphi Oracle, right? Now, we're ready finally to finish what we started. He says, I left the woods. These are, of course, very famous lines. I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps, and it's important that he uses the word perhaps, that's the fallibilist in him epistemologically. I think I'm right, I could be wrong. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one. Now here it is. That is to say, if Walden was really aptly named, as we've said in earlier lectures, it wouldn't be Walden, it would be Waldens. And there wouldn't be a Thoreau, there are Thoreaus. And there's not one of you, there's multiple of you. And of course you live multiple lifetimes. And I love that he says that. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one. He says it's remarkable how easily and insensibly we fall into a particular route and make a beaten track for ourselves. He says, I haven't lived there a week before my feet wore a path from my door to the pond side. Though it's 5 or 6 years since I trod it, it's still quite distinct, the way that we fall into ruts, the way that we find ourselves walking the beaten track. It's true, he says, I fear that others may have fallen into it and so help to keep it open. The surface of the earth is soft and impressible by the feet of men, and so with the path which the mind travels. How worn and dusty then must be the highways of the world, how deep the ruts of tradition and conformity, exclamation point. If there's anything that you want to gain from your study of Thoreau, it is to hold all things sacred, but to always challenge all things sacred, right? That is to say, always be ready to ask, to what degree is this a story I need to accept or reject? He said, I did not wish to take a cabin passage, but rather to go before the mast, and we think of Dana here, don't we, right? And on the deck of the world, for there I can best see the moonlight amid the mountains. I do not wish to go below now. In other words, he's back to his lines from book 2. I didn't want to practice resignation unless he says it was quite necessary. I learned this at least. So here we go. Finally, he's ready to tell us, what did you learn from your experiment? I learned this at least. Notice the at least is again part of that fallibilist epistemological position. By my experiment, and that's what he will call, and really his life, but for sure this time at Walden, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he's imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. He will put some things behind, will pass an invisible boundary. New, universal, and more liberal laws will begin to establish themselves around and within him. Again, now we're liberal laws, right? Or the old laws be expanded and interpreted in his favor in a more liberal sense, that he will live with the license of a higher order of beings. In proportion as he simplifies his life, the laws of the universe will appear less complex, and solitude will not be solitude, nor poverty, poverty, nor weakness, weakness. This is, of course, the theodicy of Thoreau. In other words, when terrible things happen or pain and suffering happens, don't ask, why did this happen to me? Learn to ask, why did it happen for me? And to that degree, one then can grow. And then finally, maybe the most famous lines of this chapter, of incredible lines, if you have built castles in the air, notice the use of the pronoun you, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now, put the foundations under them. And of course, earlier he was making comments about castles in the air, and now he's ready to come back to that powerful symbol, right? It's not a bad thing to dream, but you can't dream all the time. And of course, the great Bob Dylan said, in order to dream, you got to still be asleep. Dreaming isn't bad. Building castles in the air, not bad, but you've got to put the foundations under them. Go to work, in other words. As Jordan Peterson likes to remind us, clean up your room. Go to work. Take responsibility for your life. And through that taking of responsibility, you will finally find the foundations that you need. He says, it's a ridiculous demand which England and America make, that you shall speak so that they can understand you. This will sound very much like Emerson's self-reliance. Neither men nor toadstools grow so. And if they were important, and they were not enough to understand you without them. As if nature could support but one order of things, right? And then he jumps down a few lines later. He says, I desire to speak somewhere without bounds. He's already beginning to make observations for people who are ready to critique his Walden. You'll remember that the contemporary Emily Dickinson will say in her classic to the reader, judge tenderly of me. I think we have something very similar happening here as well. He says, I desire to speak somewhere without bounds, like a man in a waking moment to men in their waking moments. For I am convinced that I cannot exaggerate enough even to lay the foundation of a true expression. Who that has heard a strain of music feared then lest he should speak extravagantly any more forever? In view of the future, or possible, we should live quite laxly and undefined in front, our outlines dim and misty on that side, as our shadows reveal an insensible perspiration toward the sun. The volatile truth of our words should continually betray the inadequacy of the residual statement. Their truth is instantly translated. Its literal monument alone remains. The words which express our faith and piety are not definite, yet they are significant and fragrant like frankincense to superior natures. Why level downward to our dullest perception always and praise that as common sense? The commonest sense is the sense of men asleep, which they express by snoring. He says a few lines later, while England endeavors to cure the potato rot, will not any endeavor to cure the brain rot, which prevails so much more widely and fatally? He says, I do not suppose that I've attained to obscurity, but I should be proud if no more fatal fault were found with my pages on this score.